She was at the fence before the sun cleared the ridge. The south boundary line between the Voss property and the Bowman Ranch had a bad post, third. From the gate, she had noticed it listing 2 weeks ago and had been meaning to get to it. And the morning was cool enough for work, and she had the digger and the new post in the wagon, and there was no reason to wait for a better day. So she did not wait. Eliza Voss had learned 4 years ago that waiting for the right conditions was a habit she could not afford, and she had not unlearned it since. She set the digger into the ground beside the failing post and put her full weight behind it and began. The soil was dry from the August heat and gave grudgingly, the way things give when they have been asked nothing for a long time. She was 3 inches down when she heard the gate behind her and turned to find Hank Bowman coming across the field in his work clothes with a second digger over his shoulder, moving at the unhurried pace of a man who has decided to be somewhere and sees no reason to hurry since he is already on. She looked at him. "I've got it," she said. "I know you do," he said. He stopped beside her and drove the second digger into the ground 18 inches over. Two goes faster than one. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the post. Then she went back to work. If you already know this woman and this man have been circling something for a long time, subscribe to this channel right now and stay until the very end. Drop the name of your city in the comments below, because I want to see where this story reaches tonight. They have been neighbors for 6 years, and there has been something between them for two of those, and neither of them has named it yet. And on this particular morning in the last warm days of August 1888 in Bear Creek Ridge, Wyoming, everything is finally running out of room to stay unnamed. Don't go anywhere. Cal Voss had left on a Tuesday in the April of 1884. Not died, left. Rode out in the morning with a week's worth of provisions, and did not send word and did not come back. And the not coming back had eventually hardened from a question into a fact, the way standing water hardens into ice. Gradually and then all at once, and afterward with a permanence you could press your weight against. He had left her the ranch, which was 53 acres of good Wyoming grassland, and a house with a sound roof and a son named Thomas, 7 years old that April, and old enough to ask questions, and young enough to still believe the answers might change. Eliza had answered Thomas's questions until they stopped, and she had managed the ranch, and she had not talked about Cal Voss to anyone in Bear Creek Ridge if she could avoid it, and she had found that she could mostly avoid it by working hard enough that nobody felt they had the spare conversational room to bring him up. It was harder with herself. In the quiet hours, late evening, the narrow window between the day's last task and sleep, she had spent a long time with the question of what specifically had made her leavable. She had not arrived at a final answer. She had arrived at a working theory, and the working theory was that there was something in her, some quality, some lack, that a man would eventually locate and find insufficient, and that this was not a correctable problem, but a permanent condition she ought to account for before she let anyone make the mistake of choosing her. Again, she had been accounting for it for 4 years. Hank Bowman had moved onto the adjacent property 6 years ago, which was 2 years before Cal left and therefore predated the theory, and he was one of the few people in Bear Creek Ridge who had known Eliza in both versions of her life, before the leaving and after, and who had treated her in both versions with the same direct, uncomplicated regard that she had come to understand was simply how he was. He helped when help was needed. He did not help when it was not. He did not make commentary on what she could or could not manage, which was the thing she valued most and the thing most men in her acquaintance had been unable to provide. For 2 years, since the summer of 1886, when something in the quality of his attention had shifted in a way she had noticed, and filed away carefully without examining too closely, she had understood that his regard for her was not the uncomplicated kind she had been calling it. She had not said so. Neither had he. She had been grateful for this, and had told herself she would continue to be grateful for it, indefinitely, which was another way of saying she intended never to let the thing be named, because named things could be tested and tested things could fail, and she had already established her theory about how that ended. They dug out the old post together, and Hank held the new one plumb while Eliza tamped the fill, which was a 2-person task she had been intending to manage alone by wedging the post against the wire and hoping it held while she worked, and which went considerably faster and truer with 4 hands. She did not thank him in a way that made a production of it, because he had not made a production of coming, and she had found over 6 years that the right response to Hank Bowman's help was to receive it in the register it was offered, which was practical and without ceremony. When the post was set, he tested it with both hands, a good solid push, the kind that asked the ground a real question, and it held straight, he said. It needs to be, she said. He looked at the fence line stretching east toward the tree line, then back at her. He had a direct way of looking at people, Hank, not assessing, not calculating, simply attending. She had noticed it the first year they were neighbors and had since spent considerable effort treating it as an ordinary thing. There are 2 more posts along the east section that'll need doing before winter, he said. I saw them last week. I know about them. I'll bring the digger Saturday. She looked at him. You don't need to do that. I know, he said, in the same tone he had used when she told him she had the post handled. He picked up the old post. Where do you want this? She told him. He took it. She gathered the tools. They walked back toward the gate in the morning air, the field going gold around them in the early light, and Thomas was standing at the gate with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a boy who had come looking for his mother and found a situation he was assessing with the caution of someone who had learned that situations required assessing. He looked at Hank. Hank looked at him. Post is in, Hank said. He did not add anything to it. Thomas looked at the fence. He looked at his mother. He put his hands back in his pockets and went toward the barn. Eliza watched him go and said nothing. Hank said nothing either. They had the shared understanding, without having discussed it, that Thomas was a person who arrived at conclusions in his own time, and that the arriving could not be hurried, and that the attempt to hurry it would cost more than waiting. The fence day happened the following Saturday. Hank came with the digger, as he had said he would, and Eliza had been up since first light, and the coffee was made, and she brought a cup to the gate. When she saw him coming across the field, because it was the right thing to do for a man doing work on her land on his own time, and she handed it to him and said nothing beyond that, and he took it and drank it at the gate post in the early cool and said, "Thank you," in the plain way he said most things, and that was the whole of the ceremony. They worked the east section through the morning. 2 posts, as he had said, both needing full replacement. Thomas appeared around 9 and watched from a distance of approximately 20 yards, which was his preferred observation radius, and gradually, across the course of an hour, the radius shortened, and by 10 o'clock he was on the near side of where they were working and had picked up the spare tamping bar and was doing something with it that was not quite helping but was oriented in the right direction. Hank glanced at the boy once. He did not comment on the tamping bar. He shifted the post fractionally and said, "Hold there," and Thomas held, and that was the first time Thomas had been given a task in Hank Bowman's presence, and had taken it. Eliza was tamping the fill and did not look up, but she noted it the way she noted things that mattered, quietly and completely. At noon she went to the house and came back with cornbread and cold salt pork and a jar of the apple preserve she had put up in July, and the 3 of them sat against the fence they had just set and ate it in the August heat, the food carrying the particular flavor that outdoor work gives to a meal, everything tasting for itself in the sun and the open air. Thomas ate with the appetite of a boy who has been working, which for Thomas was new, and Hank ate the way he did everything, steadily and without waste, and he said of the cornbread, "This is good," and Thomas said, without looking up, "He makes it different than other people." "How's it different?" Hank said. "She uses less sugar and more salt," Thomas said. "She says too much sweet makes you forget there's something underneath it." Hank looked at the cornbread. Then he looked at Eliza with an expression she did not entirely trust herself to read. "That's right," he said. "It does." Eliza looked at the field. In the afternoon, Thomas asked Hank, with the deliberate casualness of a boy who has been working up to a question for a while, whether he knew how to splice a broken leather trace, because there was one on the harness that Eliza had been putting off because the splice was the complicated kind, and she did not have the right tool. Hank said he knew. Thomas brought the harness. Hank looked at it and named the specific tool required, and said he had one at the ranch house, and they could do it next week if Thomas wanted to. Watch and learn. Thomas looked at him for a moment. "All right," he said, in the tone of a person who has decided something and is confirming it. He went back to the barn. Eliza did not say anything about this until Hank was at the gate with his tools, and the sun was low, and he turned to say, "Good night," and she said instead of good night, "He doesn't ask for help, I know," Hank said. "He hasn't. With anyone. I know that, too. he said. He looked at her steadily, he asked. She looked at him. At his face in the low August light, this large and patient man, who had been at her gate for 2 years with something in his eyes she had never let herself answer. "Hank," she said. "Not tonight," he said gently. "I'm not asking you to do anything tonight." He picked up the digger. "But I'm going to ask you something soon. I want you to know that before it happens." He looked at her for one more moment, the long, level look she had been treating as ordinary for 2 years, and then he walked back across the field toward his property. She stood at the gate and watched him go. Behind her, the new fence post stood true in the late light, straight and solid and going nowhere. Wade Sutter came to the property on a Thursday, which was not his first Thursday and would not, she suspected, be his last unless she was more direct than she had been willing to be thus far. He was a reasonable man, in the way that men can be reasonable without being right. He had a wheat farm at the north end of Bear Creek Ridge, 2 hired hands, a good reputation for fair dealing, and he had looked at Eliza Voss's situation, the acreage, the house, the loan management of it, the 4 years without a husband, and arrived at the conclusion about utility and proximity that he had mistaken for affection. He was not dishonest about this, which was the best thing she could say for him. He was simply approaching the problem from the wrong direction. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee she put in front of him and said, in the particular tone of a man who believes he is resolving something, that it would make practical sense for both parties if they were to come to an arrangement before winter. The ranch management, he said, the efficiency. Thomas would have a man in the house. She looked at him across the table. Thomas has what he needs, she said. Eliza, he said, with the patience of a man who believes patience will accomplish what plain statements have not. You've been managing alone for 4 years. There's no shame in. I know there isn't, she said. I haven't felt any. He looked at her for a moment. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had done an arithmetic that didn't account for all the variables. I'll come back, he said, when you've had time to think. You can come back, she said. I'll tell you the same thing. He left. She was still at the kitchen table when she heard the knock. Not the front door, the back, the sound of someone who came through the yard. She knew before she opened it. Hank was on the back step. He had seen Sutter's wagon leaving from across the fence line, which meant he had been on the east section, and had watched, and had come without appearing to have watched, which was thoughtful in the particular way of a man who knew when something had happened that required showing up. She held the door. He came in. He sat at the table where Sutter had just been sitting, and the kitchen felt entirely different in a way she would not have been able to explain to anyone but recognized completely. She sat across from him. She did not offer coffee. He did not ask for it. He's been coming since June, Hank said. Not a question. Yes, are you going to let him keep coming? She looked at him steadily. I was going to tell him next week. Hank nodded. He looked at the table for a moment. When he looked back at her, there was something in his face that had not been visible before, or had been visible, and she had been refusing to see it, which amounted to the same thing. The patience was still there, but the waiting was gone from it. He had been a patient man. He was now a patient man who was done waiting. I said I was going to ask you something, he said. I'm asking now. He looked at her directly, no ceremony, no approach, just the fact of it. Eliza, marry me. The kitchen was very quiet. She had known this was coming. She had known it since the fence post in the morning light, and known it more clearly with every Saturday since, and she had spent those weeks constructing and discarding the response she intended to give, and the response she had arrived at. The honest one, the one she owed him, was not the yes or the no, but the reason underneath both. Hank, she said, you should know something before you say that again. He waited. Cal didn't die. She said it in the flat tone of a fact that has been stated before and lost its power to surprise her. He left, rode out one April and didn't come back, and I spent a long time afterward figuring out what it was about me that made that possible. She looked at him. I haven't entirely stopped. He held her gaze. He did not try to interrupt the accounting. I'm not easy to be with, she said. I don't ask for help, and I don't explain myself, and I've been running this property alone long enough that I've stopped knowing how to do anything with another person in the room. She paused. You'll regret choosing me. Hank Bowman looked at her across the kitchen table for a long moment, and then something shifted in his face. Not the slow shift of a man revising his position, but the quick, unguarded movement of a man who has just heard something that is, in his view, somewhat beside the point, And a smile came that she had not seen before, not in 6 years, not the polite version or the neighborly version, but the real one, and it changed his face entirely. I already regret waiting this long, he said. The kitchen went still. He said it simply, without inflation, without decoration, the way he said everything that was true, and it landed the way things land when they have been aimed correctly, not at her doubt, not at Cal Voss, not at any version of the argument she had been running, at her, directly at her, as though the doubt and Cal in the 4 years were simply weather that had been in the way, and the weather had cleared, and there she was. She looked at him. Thomas, she said, her voice was steady, he's going to have questions. I'd be concerned if he didn't, Hank said. She looked at the table, then at the window, where the August evening was going gold over the field, over the fence posts that stood true in the late light, then back at him. Saturday, she said. Come to supper Saturday. Thomas will have his questions then. All right. He stood up. He picked up his hat. He looked at her one more time, with that same direct attention she had spent 2 years calling ordinary, and was not going to call ordinary anymore. Eliza. Saturday, she said again, but she was almost smiling when she said it. He went out the back. Saturday supper was pot roast, and the last of the summer corn, and a pie she made from the August peaches that would not hold another week, and Hank came at 6 with his hat in his hands, and the particular care of a man who is dressed for something he considers worth dressing for, and Thomas was at the table already, with the expression of a boy who has been thinking hard about something since Thursday. The questions came with the pie. Thomas asked how many acres the Bowman Ranch was. Hank told him. Thomas asked if Hank intended to sell it. Hank said no. Thomas asked what would happen to this property. Hank said it would stay Eliza's, all 53 acres in her name, because it was hers and had been, and that was not a thing that required renegotiating. Thomas ate a bite of pie. He appeared to find this satisfactory. Then he asked, looking at the table rather than at Hank, whether Hank was going to leave. The kitchen went quiet in the way that kitchens go quiet when the real question has finally been asked. Hank set down his fork. He looked at Thomas with the full level attention he gave to things that deserved it. No, he said, I'm not going to leave. Thomas looked up. How do you know? Because I've been here 2 years already, Hank said, and I haven't found a reason yet. I've been looking. Thomas held his gaze for a long moment. 11 years old, his father's serious eyes, his mother's long-fingered hands flat on the table. Then he looked at his pie. He picked up his fork. All right, he said. It was the same word in the same tone that he had used when Hank offered to teach him the trace splice. Eliza heard the repetition of it and said nothing, and felt the fullness of the thing she had been holding at careful distance for 2 years arrive all at once quietly in the kitchen over peach pie. They were married in October, before the first frost, in the Bear Creek Ridge Church, with the whole of their small community present, because a wedding between two properties people had spent 2 years watching circle each other turned out to be the most satisfying thing the valley had witnessed in some time. Thomas stood beside his mother and gave her away with a gravity that made 2 women in the third pew press their handkerchiefs to their mouths, though neither of them could have said precisely what it was that moved them. Something in the boy's posture, perhaps, the particular straightness of a child who has decided that the thing happening is right and is declaring it with his whole body. Hank Bowman had waited 2 years. He would tell anyone who asked, and some did ask, in the curious way of neighbors who want to understand the shape of a thing, that the waiting had not been difficult. The waiting had been the easiest part. He had known for 2 years, and knowing had been sufficient, and if the knowing had taken longer to become action than it perhaps should have, the only person that cost was him, and he had said so plainly and did not intend to say it again because the saying had been enough. Eliza Voss Bowman did not stop managing things without asking. She did not become easy to be with, in the specific sense she had meant when she said it. She was still the woman who woke before the sun and fixed what was broken and ran the accounting in her head before anyone else had their coffee. She was still the woman who had kept 53 acres whole and solved it for 4 years by the application of daily uncommented effort. What changed was smaller than that and more permanent. She stopped maintaining the boundary line with the particular vigilance of a woman fortifying a position. The south fence still stood straight. She kept it, they kept it, because a good fence between neighboring properties is a courtesy and a fact, but It was no longer the line she managed alone in the dark before first light as a reminder of everything she was not going to ask for. She had stopped needing the reminder. She had learned what Cal Voss's leaving actually meant, that he had left. That was all, not a verdict on her, not evidence of a permanent condition. The evidence had been wrong. The working theory had been wrong, and the proof of its wrongness was a large and patient man who had come across a field with a digger over his shoulder on a morning in August and said simply that two went faster than one. He had been right about that. He had been right about most things, she found. She intended to tell him so eventually, in the plain and unhurried way that true things deserve to be said between people who had decided they had time